So good morning, Christina. Welcome back for our second office hours of the Power and Politics course. And I know you have a number of questions that have come up from the teaching fellows. So why don't we get right to it?
Yeah, we actually received a lot of questions this time, and the first one is conceptual, in particular on the principal-agent problem. So if you could explain it again and how you related it to the point that you were making on privatizing military and prison.
So the idea behind the principal-agent problem is that when you delegate somebody to act on your behalf, they're your agent. But because they're acting on your behalf, in the real world, they rapidly gather a lot of the kinds of information that's necessary to pursue your interests. That's why you're having them do it. Mm-hmm. But then they also have the advantage, if they are not inclined to carry out your interests, of having more information than you do, and particularly the information that you need to monitor them. Mm-hmm. And so if you have a divergence of interest between the principal and the agent is well positioned to take advantage of that and pursue their own agenda rather than the interests of the principal. And this is a long-standing dilemma that economists and game theorists and others have studied for decades. And basically various ways of dealing with that. One is to introduce competition among possible agents. So I think I mentioned earlier in the course the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition was that His Majesty wanted to have somebody to keep tabs on His Majesty's ministers who could replace His Majesty's ministers. And so His Majesty then gets the benefit of the information generated by the opposition and so feeds information up the chain of command, if you like. That's one way of doing it. A second way is to try and align the interests of the principal and the agent better. So if they both are looking for the same thing, then the problem sort of dissolves. Mm-hmm. And then the third is monitoring. But the problem with monitoring is that it's difficult. And so what I said in the lecture on privatization of prisons and the military is that none of the three standard paths work very well. First of all, you've got multiple principal agent challenges because it's from the voter to the politician and from the politician to the regulator and from the regulator to the privatized entity. And there are often multiple chains within those, as we saw particularly in the military. So there are many nested principal agent challenges. And then there's not much competition in either of these industries. In fact, as it turns out, the costs of generating the information to monitor them are very high because there's so many nested principal agent problems. And realigning the interests is virtually impossible because the interest of the voters to not have unnecessary wars and not lock people up unnecessarily, and that really runs diametrically into the interests of the privatized military or the prison operators. And so that's why the principal agent problems are so difficult in those contexts.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So the next couple of questions are on the rise of the right and the crisis of the left in the West that we discussed. And the first one is that there's sort of a consensus among political scientists that PR systems, multi-party systems, are relatively more democratic to two-party systems. And can you talk a little bit about that rise of that consensus among political scientists?
So there's no perfect democratic arrangement. We're in a world of what we call the second best, and that means there are trade-offs. And PR is more representative at the electoral stage because the Greens get their people in parliament and the far left Marxists get their people in parliament and the anti-immigration right-wing parties get their people in parliament. Everybody has a seat at the table. In that sense, it's more representative. But it's less representative if you think about the accountability of governments for what they actually implement, because at the time people are voting, they have no idea what government is going to actually be formed. And when it comes around to the next election, the fact that compromises had to be made in putting together a coalition mean that politicians can finger point at one another and say, well, I know we didn't carry out our mandate that we ran on, but we couldn't because of the deal we had to make in the elections. And I used the example most recently of the German national elections, where the SPD membership had been very angry about how much had been conceded in previous coalitions with the CDU, and so they chose not to go back into a coalition. But then Merkel tried and failed for 6 months to create a different coalition, which would have produced a very different kind of government if she'd been able to put it together. And eventually, out of fear that another election would make the far-right Alternative for Deutschland do even better, they went back into a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. But of course, Merkel gave up a lot. She gave up the Ministry of Finance, for example, and 5 other ministries. And so when the CDU is running next time around, and her members, well, it won't be her, it'll be her successors' members are angry, it'll be blamed on the costs of having to have put together that coalition. And so you either get more accountability at the electoral stage or more accountability at the governing stage, and you have to decide which is more important.
Right. So you touched on this a little bit, this idea of the segmented democracy, and one question we received is, what is a segmented democracy, and how exactly does it lead to polarization, and why is polarization necessarily bad for democracies?
So the phrase segmented democracy is a term coined by Douglas Ray in a very good 1999 paper called Tyrannies of Place. And what he argued there was basically that we are living in, I think I'm not sure if he used the example of New Haven, but it is the case in New Haven, for example, that many people who spend 4 years at Yale never go to many parts of the city of New Haven, which have a very different socioeconomic makeup than the paths in which they travel. So we live in increasingly isolated sub-communities, if you like, where we tend to hang around people like ourselves. So that was the argument that Ray made in 1999, and I think he pointed out there that the sense that we're all in the same boat gets undermined by that, and that creates things called empathy gaps that I'm going to be talking more about later in the course, where people stop seeing the world from the point of view of one another and thinking about one another's problems. So since Doug Ray wrote that paper, I'd mention 2 things that in the last couple of decades. One is we've seen more of that kind of segmentation because we've seen more and more red state, blue state sorting, and also more urbanization, which means blue cities in red states. So people are more and more living in communities that are like themselves. And we'll see when we look at things like housing reform, similar things happening there. And so that's just accentuated the problem that he was talking about. And then second is the developments in psychological theory that I mentioned in the course, particularly Kahneman and Tversky, who talked about framing effects, but then subsequent research by Kahneman and Cass Sunstein, who's now at Harvard, which tends to show that if you spend time with people like yourself, or you speak just to people like yourself, people tend to become more extreme. And so the net effect of that, it could be people, if you, all you ever see is people who physically bump into on the way to the store. If we go to the store anymore, we do all shopping online now. But it can also be, and we'll be talking more about this as well, it can be segmented media markets where, 30 years ago, everybody watched the same evening news, NBC, CBS, or ABC at 6:30 in the evening. And it was the same newscasters, and people were part of one conversation. When then with the advent of cable TV, we moved into a realm where people on the right get their news from Fox News, and on the left from MSNBC and so forth. And now going to Facebook and social media, this takes us even further. So that the suggestion is that this kind of segmentation, which is growing more extreme and taking on other dimensions, is a contributor to the polarization where we see, I think 25 or 30 years ago, about 3 or 4% of Democrats or Republicans thought they would be unhappy if their son or daughter married someone from the other party, and now that's gone up by orders of magnitude.
That's pretty concerning. How is that related, or how is that bad for democratic politics?
So this brings up another set of categories we've talked about: exit, voice, and loyalty. Albert Hirschman. If people can exit, they have no reason to participate in voice, in coming up with policies that are good for the polity as a whole. So what you're going to find is you're going to get people privatizing many provisions if they can afford it. And those who can't will just have to scramble and deal with what's left. And we'll see this repeating itself when we talk about things like education. We've already seen it with privatization of local government services, and in many other areas. If you have differential capacities for exit, if the costs of exit are much higher for some people than for others, that creates very bad incentives for policy, because those who can bail out will bail out, and those who cannot won't be able to provide the collective goods for themselves.
So this idea of segmentation also makes us think about the importance of relative versus absolute gains. And we talked in class that economists often stress the importance of absolute gains, but thinking about relative gains can be powerful and can be used in politics. Is that still the case to the same extent today, where we see a crisis on the left that have always had programs around inequality and redistributive wealth, etc.? And when we see like Thatcher or even Trump running campaigns that are much more based on absolute gains, where are we in this debate now? What is more important to the voters?
So the findings in the social psychology literature that are not widely understood, but I think accurate, are twofold. One is that relative differences matter to people, but they tend to be relatively local differences. So running on tax the rich, a populist campaign to run on tax the rich is not likely to be very effective politically, because people don't compare themselves to the very rich. Activists do, but most voters do not. They tend to compare themselves to similarly situated people. And that can be the source of gratifying comparisons if the people that are similar to you are rewarded in ways that are similar to yours. And it can also be the source of invidious comparisons if you think people who are basically like you are getting ahead in some way that you are not, or getting some form of recognition that you are not. And that was the capuchin monkeys illustration. So relative differences do matter, but they tend to be relatively local comparisons. Then the other thing is that when we think about what exercises people politically, and this applies to both relative and absolute, losing things, doing worse than you were before or worse than you reasonably thought you were going to be doing, or having your children do worse than you did, those are going to be more potent politically. This is Kahneman's concept of loss aversion. They're going to be more potent politically than foregoing a gain. And so the politics of saying, make America great again, is a politics of saying something was taken away from you and I'm going to get it back. And that's one of the reasons that was a very effective slogan for Trump.
Interesting. So we studied a lot how the decline in unions had led to a splintering of parties in general. And it was very hurtful for the left, and that's why we see a crisis there. Why has the right sort of benefited from that splintering, at least in PR systems?
Well, the reason is, in a nutshell, that social democratic parties that were the mainstay of the social democracy in the first 4 decades after World War II were closely connected with industrial workers and trade unions. And as industrial jobs have disappeared and unions have become weaker, those social democratic parties have been defending their members, but they're defending a shrinking labor aristocracy less effectively. It's shrinking because those jobs are going away and you get more and more workers who are not represented by, they're not industrial workers and they're not represented by the unions. So they don't feel they're being protected at all, like the long-term unemployed or people in service sectors that are not unionized. So that they are available for mobilization by other parties. They may go to the Greens, they may go to the far, in Germany, to Der Linke, the far left group, or they may, as we actually saw on one of the slides in the lecture, they may get mobilized by the far right as anti-immigrant, if they think their jobs are being taken by immigrants, which it's easy to convince people of, whether it's true or not, being beside the point, usually not true. So that's one reason. There are fewer and fewer people. Whereas in days of yore, when virtually the whole economy was unionized in a country like Germany, and they had in place agreements that the bargaining arrangements made in the unionized parts of industries would be replicated even in the ununionized parts. You didn't have that divergence of interest, and you didn't have these people available for mobilization. Then the second problem is that these left of center parties are weaker. They've all had to make huge concessions in order to get power at all, and this is true in two-party systems. We talked about New Labour and the New Democrat, but it's also true in multi-party systems. So you see the SPD implemented the Hartz reforms in the first 5 years of the century in Germany, which were very pro-business, creating more labor market flexibility, all the things that business tends to want as conditions for retaining power. Though actually they lost power anyway in 2005, despite having implemented all of the Hartz IV reforms. So it's basically, the story is a less powerful left of center parties defending fewer workers, and that makes them available for mobilization by others.
I mean, you just brought it up. It seems like the left cannot respond any more effectively to the needs of workers that have been laid off and kind of are in this post-industrial society now where new needs have emerged. And is it an unwillingness, or is there a structural reason as to why these center-left parties are unable to cater to these needs anymore? Where do you see this crisis emerge? What is driving it?
Well, I don't think they're unable to, but they have not done. And I think it's partly not understanding the real dynamics of what are going on. It's partly living in the past. It's partly not seeing, and this will be a big theme of the last part of the course, it's it's not seeing that insecurity, long-term employment insecurity, is a much more serious problem for most workers than inequality, for example.
Right.
And I think the focus of activists on inequality doesn't really serve the political left well in multi-party systems or in two-party systems. That while some reduction in inequality is going to be important for reasons having to do with empathy gulfs and other things I'm going to talk about, the most important medium-term strategy for parties that are going to do well in the future are going to be strategies that address employment insecurity. The fact that, you know, somewhere between most 18-year-olds today in industrialized countries are going to be facing changing their jobs maybe 12 to 15 times in their employment lifetimes. That is a completely new world, and you know, much of it has to do with technology and the mobility of capital, but attacking immigrants or complaining about inequality will not address it. You really have to see what's driving. Everybody talks about there's more polarization, there are more angry voters, but they don't say enough about why, what's actually driving it. And the big theme is insecurity, and so it's strategies for confronting insecurity that are going to be where the rubber meets the road going forward.
Interesting. So it's less of a structural problem and more a problem of lack of innovation and trying to understand how to cater to these new needs.
Well, it's a structure. I think it's a structural problem, but it's a different structural problem than a lot of people are focusing on. The basic structural problem is the changed nature of labor markets, and it's not a cyclical problem. It's a structural problem. And so even though, you know, in the U.S. now we have less than 4% unemployment, that's not a relevant statistic politically, because you have a lot of people employed who might be working at McDonald's who 15 years ago were working on an assembly line as a middle level or maybe even lower level manager. So they might be employed, but they're downwardly mobile, they're making less money, they may well be only being able to put bread on the table by having two rather than one wage earner in the family. They may have children in their 30s who are not employable or certainly not employed. So they don't show up as unemployed, but they are deeply disaffected people with very good reason. And unless politicians can come up with policies to address the needs of those people, that we're going to get more of the sort of politics we've been seeing since 2016.
Interesting. So let's shift gears a little bit. We also received a lot of questions on privatization. And I know you had this little poll with the audience where you asked the terms neoliberalism and Washington consensus, kind of which one is more negative, kind of has a more negative connotation. And could you clarify again why neoliberalism is kind of a more negative term than the Washington consensus here in the United States?
Well, I would say I thought it was very revealing when I did the poll in the class that more people thought neoliberalism is a pejorative term than the Washington consensus.
Oh, I asked this question wrong, so should I say it again?
Pardon?
I think I asked the question incorrectly, so should I say it again?
I think when I ran the poll in the class,
people said neoliberalism was more.
People perceived neoliberalism to be a pejorative term, but not so much the Washington consensus. However, if, as you know, because you're an expert on the global South, go around the global South, go around Africa, go to India and ask about the Washington consensus, and you get a very different answer. And so, you know, I think the takeaway there is simply that the idea that we should be tightly disciplined isn't so appealing as the idea that other people should be tightly disciplined. I don't think it's more complicated than that.
Another question we received is, what are some of the analytical frameworks that are useful in helping us to think about the impact of privatization on the role of the state?
I think the exit, voice, and loyalty is the heart of the matter there, because if you think about privatization, you know, when we come back to the the issue of housing. So, you know, people used to think gated communities were things for rich people, right? Rich people would shut themselves off. And that's no longer true. We've got, you know, these community interest developments. In the U.S., 10 years ago, which was the most recent data I could find, there were over 60 million people. It's 20% of the U.S. population. There's probably 70 million people today living in these communities. And so this connects back to the segmented democracy. You go to go to Miami or Fort Lauderdale, for example, and you know, you'll just see moving a quarter of a mile back from the water a different price for these from multi-million to, you know, $80,000 if you get far enough away. And so you've got gated communities that correspond to different income levels. And then, of course, those who can't afford any. But the problem is going to be if some people can bail out and provide their own policing and their own utilities and their own street lights and their own garbage pickup and their own swimming pools, then you're going to get the under-provision of public goods for the rest. And that's going to be the problem. And we see this with education. We'll spend a whole class on education, but essentially the fact that you have a system in which people can either bail out physically into suburban towns or can bail out fiscally by sending their kids to private schools, mean that all of those people have incentives to underprovide good schools for the rest of the country.
Right.
We see it in healthcare. Once you no longer have the individual mandate, which was part of the Obamacare law that was repealed as part of Trump's 2017 tax reform, the individual mandate was repealed. The problem then is you get what economists call adverse selection in insurance markets, because the only people who voluntarily want to buy insurance then are sick people. But that creates very expensive pools to insure. The whole idea of insurance pools is that everybody's in them, and so you drive down the price that way. And so insurance markets will just unravel, just as, you know, if you said we don't have to have auto insurance, you know, the most dangerous people wouldn't insure, the people who had no assets anyway. And so so there's certain kinds of markets where unless everybody participates, you get this problem of adverse selection, and the markets unravel. And so that's the problem when you have very different capacities for exit. Just one more example. In Oregon, I think it was, they were trying to decide which procedures would be covered in Medicaid, which is insurance for poor people. And they held deliberative, town hall meetings about that, to vote and to debate and to vote on which procedures would be covered. But then it turned out that the great majority of the people there were not on Medicaid. So you know, for them, it's an academic question, or worse, that, you know, they don't want to pay more, you know, Medicaid, partly federal block grants, but it's also taxes raised at the state level. They don't have any interest in paying more taxes to cover more Medicaid procedures that they're not using, right? So this is the problem if you have different capacities for exit, but not for decision making, and that's the real. So I think it's a Hirschman story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this term privatization as a category seems to be covering a lot, and it's often justified in terms of how we precisely define public goods. And we talked about the definition brought forward by economists. And a student was interested in how does the rhetoric of public versus private use actually function in political discourse, and has it shifted over time? And is the term public good deployed differently now than a few decades ago?
Well, public goods as it's used in common discourse is much broader than public goods as it's used by economists, because the number of things that are really public goods in the economist sense is very small. It's like, you think clean air is a public good. Even that, if we could all have, bubbles over our heads and backpacks with oxygen tanks, maybe even clean air would stop being a public good. Because for something to be a public good in the economist sense, it must be both supplying it non-excludable, so giving it to me that can't. If we create it for me, we build a road for me, we can't stop you driving on it, and non-rivalrous. So if I enjoy sunshine, it doesn't stop you enjoying it. If I enjoy the driving on the road, doesn't. That's a very. For instance, most people think it's very narrow. Most people think education is a public good. Education doesn't fit that definition. It's easy to exclude people from education. And think about, 5 people consuming a teacher's time versus 50 people consuming a teacher's time. It clearly is rivalrous, because they're going to get much less well educated if they're 50 than if they're 5. So education in the economist sense is not a public good, but 9 out of 10 people think education is a public good. And so I think in common understanding, it's people want to call public goods are things that have a lot of negative externalities. So if you have a bad education system, bad public education system, even if you are educating your children at private schools, there's going to be a lot of fallout of having a bad educational system. You're not going to have a well-educated labor force. You're going to probably have a lot of crime. You're going to have all these other. So you get a lot of negative externalities, but that's not the same thing as saying that education's a public good.
Right.
Then the question becomes how to manage the externalities. So I think that's the conceptual point. And so the economist definition of a public good is much too narrow, certainly to cover a lot of what people have been talking about, privatizing, many, many things.
Yeah.
And I think the theory of privatization is just that government's not very good at doing things. As Reagan said, government is the problem.
Yeah.
And so, so you think about other solutions, and I think that's where a lot of the impetus to privatize things like railroads and utilities and so on came from. And then you have to trade off the way that externalities are handled when the government's doing it with the ways externalities are handled when the private sector's doing it. So if you privatize the railways, well, yeah, but there may be communities that don't have enough people to make it worthwhile for anybody to run a train there. And so you're going to get a Hirschman problem start to the people who can exit will exit to happy conditions, and those who are left behind will be worse off.
Right. You just talked about CIDs, and I know in class we also talked about their negative implications. For example, how do you still cater to the needs of the homeless, all of that. Another negative implication could be also just the impact that the elite secession has on just what the government provides for the population in general, because the elite has more power to demand public goods from the government, and if the demands of the elite are met by private solutions, then we could end up with situations like in the developing world where these public goods are not being provided anymore, or they're just decreasing in quality, as we see maybe in the US or in Europe. So what is your comment on that?
So this is going to be a major theme of the last part of the course, so I'll just speak briefly to it now, but a big part of the source of our politics since 2016 is a byproduct of the elite's complacency about exactly that. So in the 30s, when we had 20% unemployment and a communist system out there competing for the hearts and minds of American workers, there were many people among business elites who understood the importance of not creating a situation where workers felt they had nothing to lose but their chains, as Marx and Engels had put it in the Communist Manifesto. After the collapse of communism, where there's no real alternative out there, the sort of path of least resistance to move to the suburbs and build more prisons or move to gated communities and sort of out of sight, out of mind, it's a very easy path to go, but the cost is all of these vulnerable, underserved populations who are being left behind by all the technological innovation, eventually be turning into dynamite, political dynamite that can then be mobilized in ways that the elites are not going to like.
Yeah.
And so the complacency of the elites has fed this idea that they can exit, to come back to Hirschman, has fed a lack of attention to the sorts of problems that are now exploding in their faces.
Very interesting. So shifting gears a little bit, a student also had a question on the military. And we discussed how kind of using military contractors reduces the costs of war. So it might make the U.S. more likely to go to war in the first place. At the same time, in the U.S., we also have an all-volunteer force that appears increasingly isolated from the population as a whole. So how do we, is it necessary to make war cheaper on the contractor front if we already have this other development that kind of, it's all volunteer anyways, and it is more isolated it's becoming more isolated to the general population?
So I think the arithmetic there is just wrong. So if you compare the first Gulf War in 1991, where even then we had a lot of military contractors, we used about 500,000 troops in that war. When we're talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about very small numbers, nowhere near that, and I think we tried to keep our American troops below 10,000 in Afghanistan. And first of all, if you really wanted to hire 500,000 military contractors to occupy a country, probably couldn't do it. So, I mean, the cost would be, I don't even know there would be 500,000, but the cost would be enormous. So if you're going to fight a successful war, it's still going to be very expensive. Now, it is true that the technology of war is changing rapidly, and so in terms of just destroying a country, we'll be able to do it with drones, and but we've had that capacity since the advent of nuclear weapons. And the truth is, having the capacity to destroy a country does not translate into the capacity to subdue its population and govern it, as we've seen with the now, 17-year ungovernable Afghanistan, and look just at Iraq. 25 million people in Iraq, and we occupied them. Despite Abu Ghraib and all the kind of haphazard use of vicious force that I talked about as a sign of a weak state, we were not able ever to govern effectively. Or just look at Syria, where we've again been involved since 2012. And failed miserably in that civil war context. So I think that the idea that you can subdue populations without large numbers of troops is a fantasy. And if you're really going to try and do that with if you think of the wars we've been fighting in Afghanistan, in Iraq and Syria, paying a professional army to fight those would be colossally expensive, And it's probably not possible to turn over the governance of an occupied country
Yeah.
to a mercenary force. So I don't think, that everybody focuses on the technology of war, but, and I'm going to talk more about this in upcoming lectures, that has very little to do with creating a Weberian state that can monopolize the coercive use of force in a given territory.
Okay, thank you. So our last question brings us back to the lecture we had on Thursday on prisons. And I know that you showed two graphs that were very interesting. So there was a decrease in violent crimes over time, but then we see an increase in incarceration rates. And we talked about the reasons for the decline in violent crimes, for example, and more education for women. But can you clarify the puzzle here that despite the decrease in violent crimes, we do see an increase in incarceration rates?
So, as I said, there are multiple competing explanations for that out there, including the argument that incarceration is working, which if you look at the data, I don't find it very credible, but I suspect it's not. I think, based on my reading of the literature, the biggest predictor of violent crime in a country is males in the population between the ages of 18 and 25. I actually thought the more interesting puzzle was not that one, but the graph, the next graph I put up, which shows that violent crime has been going down, but people believe that it's been going up. One student came and talked to me about at the end of the class, was this a byproduct of 9/11, because that's when the perception that crime is going up really takes off. There might be something to that. But I think there's been, for much longer term than that, a big disjunction between how much violent crime people believe there is and how much violent crime there actually is. As with, for example, immigration, illegal immigration, we're seeing this play out now. There's a massive disjunction. Most people think it's going up, but it's actually been going down for a very long number of years. And I think that the answer here is in that work I mentioned of a political scientist called Stuart Sheingold. And it's essentially what economists call cheap talk. It's very easy to run for office on these issues because you find a bogeyman, you find somebody to blame, which is always easy in politics, and then most of the solutions turn out not to be expensive to you politically. So federal politicians can run on getting tough on crime, but most convictions and incarceration occurs in state prisons. So it's essentially creating unfunded mandates on the states for the most part. And if you think about immigration, Trump said, and Mexico will pay, and Mexico will pay, but they're not paying. And that's partly why he's run into so much opposition now to actually build his wall, because it's going to cost American taxpayers if they really do it. And representatives, including, even when the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, he couldn't get them to ante up the money for his wall. But that's atypical. Most of the running against crime, it's cheap talk for politicians to whip up support for something that is not going to be costly to them down the road politically.
Right. Great. These were all the questions for this time.
We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.